Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Go Beyond. My name is Alyssa Robinson, and I am sitting here with Reverend Daniel Humbert, our senior pastor here at Trietsch. And Go Beyond is a time that we like to dig deeper into whatever message we heard on Sunday. So Daniel brought us the message this Sunday. We are in the middle of a worship series called Faith Works, in which we are traveling through the book of James together. And so this week we are on James chapter 4, which is a pretty rough chapter. It really is, it hits you right in the heart, right in the gut, and pointing the finger of you need to do better. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I strongly encourage that if you have not read, first of all, the book of James is only 5 chapters. It's a really easy read. But if you have not yet read chapter 4 and you're ready to be challenged, give it a read because it is good stuff. But I'm going to go straight into our first question today because this week was all about godliness and worldliness. And that's one of the things we love to say as Christians is be in the world, but not of the world. But James talks a little bit about what that means, but I found it to be kind of confusing. So hopefully Daniel can clarify a few things for me. I don't know if you found it to be confusing too. But in one of the first verses of James chapter 4, it says, being a friend of the world makes you an enemy of God. And I want some clarification scripturally, contextually, even if something in the translation is off. What does it mean to be a friend of the world?
Well, so that verse 4 is very rich. There's some words there that all kind of catch us off guard. So, he starts that verse with you adulterers, right? So, right off the bat, he's slapping us in the face and saying, pay attention because you're an adulterer. And what he means in that simple sense is not somebody who's sexually immoral, but you have been deeply unfaithful. You are clearly not following God's path. And so for the Hebrews, that was a catchphrase, if you will, that just said, pay attention because this is serious stuff. And then when he uses the words friendship and enemy, that's sort of ancient language or Greco-Roman language for sort of kowtowing, if you will, or catering to the things of this world, the ways of this world. That's the friendship part. And then the enemy of God part is not following God's way. So when he talks about friendship, it's not really friendship like two people who hang out together and relate together. His friendship means you're sort of catering to the ways of this world. And for him, just like for Paul, that would be things like, vindictiveness and spitefulness and hatefulness and gluttony and greed and those kinds of things. That's what he really means. And if you're doing that, he would say, then you're an enemy of God or you have enmity towards God. So that's what he's talking about.
Well, and when it talks about being a friend of the world, it sounds like, could we get some clarification around what does that mean for participating in the culture of the world? Because that's where I started to feel a little weird about it because I was like, okay, Jesus was a friend of the world. He came into this world and put himself in the context of a culture, spoke to people in terms that they understood, oftentimes using cultural norms to illustrate a story. At what point are we crossing a line by participating in the cultures that we live in? Or is there something around Christianity that we're not supposed to be connected to our own culture?
So that's a great question. And unfortunately, I didn't have time in the message to address it. And I'll do my best here in a short amount of time. But Jesus was a friend of the world to the degree that he loved the world with his entire self, that he gave himself for the world, that he cared about everybody with whom he came in contact, and that he wanted people to become better about that kind of love, right? That's how Jesus was a friend of the world. But Jesus was not a friend of the world to the degree that he sort of lived into the cultural mores of the world, right? So he came in humility. The cultural more of the world of the time was pomposity and hubris and power, right? And so Jesus was not about any of that. So he wasn't a friend of those things, but he was a friend to the people by being humble, by being a servant, by caring for people and catering to their needs, if you will. And so when James or Paul says, let's not be a friend of the world, that's what he means. Let's not give in to the cultures of the world. And so that's when I talked about in my message about idolization. When we idolize political parties or when we idolize nations, then we are befriending the world. We are befriending the ways of the world. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't be political, and it's not to say we shouldn't be patriotic to the country that for whom we have a great admiration. But it does mean we should not blend the two. We should not blend politics and nationality. Jesus was not an American. Jesus knew nothing of our nation or any other nation for that matter. He knew of ethnicities and he knew of distinctions and nationalities, if you will. But Jesus didn't claim any of that, nor did he portray any of that. And so that's what James is trying to identify. And it's hard because we all live in this world, right? And we all live in the ways of the world. And so the challenge for Christians is to never let those things, whatever they are, and I just named two. I mean, there's all kinds of other things. The challenge for Christians is to not let those things dictate our faithfulness, but rather our faithfulness to have influence over those things, over our patriotism, or have influence over our politics, rather than politics having influence over our faith. And I think that's the danger we're running right now in our country, is that we're allowing politics to influence our faith and not the other way around.
Well, and you talked a little bit earlier because it's such strong language to say that if you are a friend of the world, you are an enemy of God. And that really struck me because it feels so dualistic of either you are this way or you are God's enemy. And then I just wonder, is it really possible to be the enemy of God? And if I am acting in a way that I am acting as the enemy of God, is that a permanent installation? I am now the enemy. Can you put some context around that for us?
I mean, so this is language. James wants us to pay attention, right? So he's going to use very strong language. It's much like when Jesus says, golly, if I sin with my tongue, I need to cut it off. Or if I sin with my hand, I need to cut it off. Did Jesus really mean that? No, he didn't mean for us to walk around, sort of without arms or legs or whatever. He just meant pay attention. This is strong stuff. So in this case, the Greek word here represents enmity. And enmity, of course, at its root has the same concept of enemy, but the basic concept is you are hostile toward or you're in direct opposition to. And so if you're in bed with the world, if you will, if you're sort of covying up with what the ways of the world are, hatred and spitefulness and greed and gluttony and whatever, then you clearly are opposed to God's ways, which are justice and love and mercy and kindness, right? And so that's what he means. He just uses very strong language to identify that you can't serve both of these things. That's Jesus's language as well, right? We can't serve God and wealth. We can't serve two masters. We'll either love the one or hate the other. This is James's way of saying the same thing. You can't be of and in this world and keep God as the primal authority and the primary way that you want to conduct your life.
Well, and I think I would feel that anyone watching growing up in the American culture, that would strike a chord with us, right? Because we are all about power. We are all about, what James called selfish ambition. And how are we? It's a very individualistic culture that we live in of how am I living the American dream? And so, I was a little confused when I was reading chapter 4, verse 13, and I'm going to read a little bit of that. It says, "Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such town and spend a year there doing business and making money, yet you do not even know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wishes, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Anyone then who knows the right thing to do and fails to do it commits sin. And the second, going around verse 17, if you know the right thing to do and you don't do it, then that's sinful. I get that. But in the beginning, it was confusing to me because it seemed like it was saying we shouldn't plan for the future or shouldn't make short-term business decisions that will bring us wealth. It was just confusing to me. So shouldn't we plan for the future in our businesses and try to be profitable?
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of people would argue, especially in the US. I hear this argument all the time. The more money you make, the more opportunity you have to be generous to God.
Yeah, well, there is a certain degree of truth to that, right? If I'm a generous person, the more I make, the more generous I will be, right? So here's the deal. This is a perfect example of biblical authors being people of their day and of their context. And James, just like Paul, was a person in the context that believed to the core of his gut that Jesus was going to return while they were still alive. And so Paul would write about it in multiple letters. This is James's philosophy as well. And if indeed that's the case, I mean, it's why Paul would say, golly, if you can't control yourself, go ahead and get married. But it's really better to remain single because Jesus is coming any day. And in James's language, it's, hey, you don't really need to prepare for the future. He doesn't say this part, but basically what he means is because Jesus is coming back any day now. And therefore, why sort of quote unquote waste your time trying to plan for that future? So this is one of those scriptural texts that's really specific to its day and to its context and should not be used specifically for today, for instance. Now, having said that, I would say, as a person who plans for my retirement and who plans for the future and certainly casts vision for the ministry of the church, I do think there is a sense in which we've got to be careful about that we don't get so wrapped up in, golly, what's that going to be like and how can I make sure that that's all planned? Because for instance, retirement is a 20th century creation, right? So for centuries before the 20th century, nobody retired, nobody planned for retirement, nobody. And so
It was also more communal where you had people to depend on and the community would take care of you in your old age. And we don't have that anymore.
Yeah, that's right. And so again, that's why this particular passage that is confusing for the modern age I hesitate to say it makes no sense for the 21st century, but it's difficult to apply its specific wisdom with regard to that, other than, hey, don't get so anxious and so uptight about that you can't really live in the moment. He's not saying, I don't believe, for today, hey, don't ever plan for the future. But he was saying for his day, hey, Jesus is coming back any day. So don't get so bogged down in planning for the future that you lose sight that Jesus is coming back. And we want him to do that, right? So it's a great example of the cultural context of certain scriptures.
Well, and the last question that I have is something that you specifically mentioned within your sermon on Sunday. What does it mean to submit yourself to God? Because you brought up the examples of submitting yourself to God through spiritual practices. And within our church, you talked about the spiritual health assessment that we're going to have coming up and the fact that we recognize 7 spiritual practices within our congregation. Where does that come from? Where does Jesus mention engaging with spiritual practices to get closer to God, and those specifically?
Yeah. Well, so Jesus doesn't so much say, hey, practice this or practice that. Jesus does those things, right? Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, or Jesus is generous with his love, or Jesus celebrates and worships God. And so Jesus was much more about actually doing these things, practicing these things. Even with regard to scripture, he would constantly be quoting what we now call Hebrew scriptures or Old Testament scriptures, because they were ingrained in his life. He had engaged them his entire life. So Jesus never said, hey, do these things so much. He did with regard to prayer and he did with regard to service. But it's really Paul and others who go on to point out, and James too, that we submit to God by handing our life over. And I maintain that the way we hand our life over to God, submission, which is, by the way, a very hard concept, as you've already pointed out, for Western culture, because all of Western culture, not just America, is very much about, hey, I'm a self-made person. I can do this on my own. I can make this happen for myself, yada, yada. And so submission's a hard concept. So, but in Christianity, submission means if I hand myself over, what I maintain is that the way we hand ourselves over to God is by taking up those spiritual practices. It is a known quality, if you will, that when I engage those seven that we talk about as core, they're not the only ones, but we believe they're the core seven, that when we take those up, man, they help us become a friend of God more than a friend of the world, that they change our heart, that they change our mind, that they change the way we interface with people. And that makes sense, obviously, when you think about it in terms of like relationship. If I'm in a small group, I can't help but know other people, learn about other people, understand other people better. If I'm in scripture, I can't help but know God's heart better, right? If I'm in conversation with God through prayer, I can't help but begin to better know what God desires for me. I mean, and that's sort of how it all works. When I'm in service to other people, it humbles my heart and helps me to remain connected to other people. That's why that's important, and why I think the assessment will be so critical to us, not only learning about spiritual practices, but then the prescriptions that will come will help us better engage them and use them for us to submit to God, to humble ourselves to God. And I believe it changes people. I'm just convinced of it.
Oh. Well, thank you. That is about all the time that we have today. On Wednesday, today we were talking a little bit about the context of scripture. On Wednesday, we're going to be digging deeper into today's culture, because a lot of what James was talking about was kind of, as Christians, we are not necessarily feeding into the culture that we live in. And we might nod along to that and say, yeah, that makes sense. But then when we actually start to dig into it, we're like, wait a second, you're changing the entire structure of our, the way that we understand how the world works. And so I'm really excited for Wednesday to ask some questions. And I hope that you'll join us. So remember that you can tune into all past episodes of Go Beyond at tmumc.org/go beyond. And that spiritual health assessment that we talked about is going to be coming out within this week. And so just keep an eye at tmumc.org/next steps to see when that health assessment is coming out, so that you can start to take those next steps into what you can do to grow deeper in your relationship with God. But until Wednesday at 12:30, hope you have an amazing week. Bye, everybody.